Hi everyone and welcome to Newegg TV. My name is Paul and this is our SSD video. It's meant to be an introduction to our SSD store here on Newegg.com, as well as a bit of a tutorial on SSDs, their pros and cons, their ins and outs, their what have yous. So first off, well, here are a bunch of SSDs in front of me, and you might be wondering, what is an SSD? SSD stands for solid state drives. They are storage drives with no moving parts. And let's start out by giving a quick comparison between the older hard drive or HDD technology versus SSDs. So by comparison, most folks have been using this for the past, 15, 20 plus years in their computers. This is a standard magnetic hard drive. It is 3.5 inches wide, and it uses an older technology that is still very viable, especially if you need a lot of storage. You can get hard drives that are 2-3 terabytes in capacity. This is an SSD, and it is a 2.5 inch SSD, and by comparison there are no moving parts inside this SSD, which is helpful for a few reasons, but I did want to real quickly show you the inside of a mechanical hard drive. This is a 2.5 inch mechanical hard drive right here. Don't worry, it was already dead because our producer, Mr. Lamb, touched it. But inside a mechanical hard drive, you have a spinning platter or platters, such as this one. They spin around, and similar to a record, it has a drive read head that will move out over the surface of the drive and read bits of data off of that are stored magnetically by moving a little metal filament into one or two positions. That represents a 0 or a 1. As we all know, in computers, all data boils down to zeros and ones, and that's pretty much how you stored and read data. SSDs work in a bit of a different way. They use NAND flash memory, and we're going to get into a lot more details on this, but essentially that's your difference between magnetic old school hard drives and newer SSDs. So there are quite a few pros and cons. We're going to talk about SSD pros first. The first and biggest one is that they're much faster than these magnetic hard drives. No drive head needs to move over the surface of a platter to access data. It's just instantly accessed in usually less than 1/10 of a second, or it's usually measured in milliseconds. Also, SSDs do generally have a fairly long lifespan, 4 to 5 years at least, with typical day-to-day use. And they're also smaller, they're lighter, they're cooler, and they're more power efficient than their mechanical hard drive brethren, and they generate no noise because, again, no moving parts. As far as cons go, SSDs generally, at least as far as the making of this video, cost significantly more price per gigabyte wise than mechanical hard drives. And you do need to make sure that you're using an SSD under the right environments to make sure that you don't have any slowdown. That is, for the most part, not an issue anymore if you're using the right operating system and the right hardware. But the final thing is that capacity-wise, SSDs typically are a lot less. For instance, this is a 500 gig mechanical hard drive versus a 32 gig SSDs, although you can get much higher capacities than this. So now we've compared with hard drives, let's talk more specifically about SSDs and physically the SSD itself. This, for example, is a 2.5 inch SSD. Most SSDs you'll find out there are 2.5 inch, sometimes known as the notebook hard drive form factor. So they will fit in notebooks. At least you should make sure that they are not too thick to fit in your notebook if that's what you're buying it for. But if you are putting it into a standard PC, you might need a 2.5 inch to 3.5 inch adapter, just like that. That will simply allow you to mount that physically into your 3.5 inch drive bay on a standard case. There are a few other form factors that you might find out there for SSDs. You can find 3.5 inch SSDs, just like this OCZ Colossus I'm showing you here. This one, for example, will just natively fit into that 3.5 inch bay. Sometimes they are this size for convenience for people with older cases. Sometimes they're this size because, like this one here, it's actually 960 gigabytes in capacity. You also have smaller drives. This, for example, is a 1.8 inch SSD. This has a micro SATA connector, so make sure that you have either an adapter or that your notebook that you're installing that into natively has that adapter. That's a 1.8 inch. You also have now M-SATA drives, and those use a different connector. It's actually a mini PCI Express connector that's wired for serial ATA, but these typically are to go inside sometimes notebooks, sometimes motherboards have this adapter in them, sometimes super small mini ITX computers also have this, but there's an M-SATA drive. And then finally, we also have PCI Express SSDs. For example, here's an OCZ RevoDrive. This will just allow you to drop this straight into a PCI Express slot onto your motherboard. That will give you additional throughput because PCI Express does have greater bandwidth than serial ATA, and these are generally super high performance drives like the OCZ RevoDrive family. So next up, let's talk about actually physically plugging in your SSD, and I'm going to be talking about your typical serial ATA connected SSD as opposed to an mSATA or a PCI SSD. For starters, you need to route a power cable over, and the longer of the two plugs here is your serial ATA power cable. Just route a cable over from your power supply. You can use a Molex to serial ATA adapter if you don't have one of these, and you plug that right in. Remember that these are keyed. They have an L shape to the plug, so you can only plug them in one way, and the plugs on the SSD itself can be delicate, so try not to wedge it too much. Once you've got your power plugged in, you will need to next up plug in your data connection. Here is a serial ATA data cable here, and you'll notice again this is a keyed plug, so you can only plug that in one way. You will plug one end into the serial ATA port of your preference on your motherboard. Best to use your SATA 3 ports if possible, and the other end goes right into your SSD. Now you may notice that this particular serial ATA cable has a nice reassuring SATA 3 sticker on it, so you will say, yes, this is a SATA 3 cable, it will work with my SATA 3 drive, even though this is admittedly a SATA 2 drive, but just for the purposes of an example. But the folks over at Maximum PC actually did some tests on this because they were curious. What's the difference between a SATA 1 cable like this one here and a SATA 2 or a SATA 3 cable like that? Turns out, speed-wise, there is no difference. So if you have an older SATA 1 or SATA 2 cable lying around and you need to plug in an SSD, don't worry, it will work. You will not suffer any speed slowdown by using an older cable. Really, the main differences between the new ones are you get some fancier things like the little clasps on there that make sure that the plug stays plugged in securely. Also, if you're not, for instance, going to plug in via your serial ATA port right there, you could have a card that drops into a PCI Express slot like that. And then this board also actually has that mSATA port I was talking about right there. That's a little bracket that you can plug a little mSATA SSD into. So now let's talk about what is inside this 2.5-inch housing here for our SSD. Bear in mind, if you have an SSD and you want to remove the cover like this, you're not going to kill the drive, but you might kill your manufacturer's warranty. So it's not always a wise decision unless you don't have to return the drive and you know that you don't, versus mechanical hard drives where if you open it up, your mechanical hard drive is going to die. But there's the SSD. You can see the printed circuit board. You can see the serial ATA connectors. You can see the NAND flash memory there. And over here on this side, you can see the SSD controller. These are the parts that are necessary. They're also what really determines the speed of your SSD. So for starters, let's talk about the controller over here. And this, right there is a SandForce controller. And the controller does quite a few different things, but it's going to really affect the speed of your SSD depending on the controller you use. Some are faster than others. Controllers also do stuff like wear leveling. SSD NAND has a certain amount of program erase cycles that it can do over the life of the drive, and the controller makes sure that it distributes reads and writes across all of the NAND on the drive. That way it wears it out evenly over time. That's also a big reason why you never defrag an SSD. But controllers also do what is called garbage collection, which there are a few different versions of. They also control compression. When it's writing data to the NAND, it might compress it, if that is possible, before doing that to speed up your writes. So not just the controller, but also the firmware for the controller, which is generally handled by the manufacturer of the drive itself. Next up is the NAND flash, right here on the back. Oh, wait, I was going to do a list of controller manufacturers. I have a short list here. This isn't all of them, but it's a good list. Indalinks is one that was recently actually acquired by OCZ. There's also Intel, J-Micron, Marvell, Samsung, SandForce, like this one here, and Toshiba. So there's some SSD controller manufacturers that you might be interested in. Next up, let's talk about the NAND flash memory here, and you can see all these different modules. This has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and this is a 120 gig drive. The NAND flash can be manufactured by a few different companies as well. Very common right now are IMFT, which is the joint venture by Intel and Micron, Intel Micron Flash Technology. They make both synchronous and asynchronous flash memory. Toshiba and Samsung also have a bit of a collaboration. They make toggle flash memory, which also is very high quality. You'll see that in a lot of high-end performance drives. The manufacturing process of the NAND chips itself is going to be distinguished by a measurement. So recently we've seen 20 nanometer and 19 nanometer manufacturing processes that are just now starting out. You'll commonly see 25 nanometer, 32 nanometer NAND, and that just means you're going to have more density on the chip itself. Each little chip here is going to be able to store more data. And generally speaking, synchronous is going to be the faster, the faster and also more expensive of the two, and asynchronous will give you, you'll see in more budget drives. Also, these NAND chips can be identified as either MLC memory or SLC memory. Basically, a bit of flash memory like this stores bits of data in memory cells. And in NAND flash memory, those are all in a line, and it can only reprogram all of them at once. They're divided up into pages. For SLC, single level cell, it stores one bit of data per flash memory cell. And for MLC, it can actually store 2 bits of data. And we're actually going to be seeing 3 bits data memory become available soon as well. SLC memory is more expensive, but it is faster, less dense. MLC memory is more dense, a little bit slower, and you'll be able to find that. It's much more common right now, but you'll be able to find that for cheaper prices than SLC memory-based drives. Also, as mentioned, because the bits of data in the memory chips here are arranged in pages, you actually have what is called program erase cycles, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the next section. So next up, I wanted to talk a little bit about garbage collection, and the most common form of that is called trim. I'm going to explain to you in a second more specifically what garbage collection is, but I also wanted to say how to set it up, and here's one of the most important things you can do in order to install Windows or any other operating system onto your SSD. The first thing you're going to want to do is go into your serial ATA controller. This, for example, is a Gigabyte motherboard that has a native Z68 chipset, which has a serial ATA controller as part of it. And basically you want to go to your serial ATA controller mode. You'll notice here that there are a few options. You see IDE, you see RAID, and you see AHCI. If you have left your serial ATA controller in IDE mode and you install Windows or another operating system onto the drive, you're going to have problems, or at the very least you're not going to be able to get the maximum speed that you would want out of your SSD. You need to use either RAID mode or AHCI mode. AHCI is Advanced Host Controller Interface. That exposes a lot of the higher level functions of your serial ATA controller and by extension your SSD. RAID is also AHCI capable, so if you have a serial ATA revision 2 or revision 3 capable motherboard, set that controller to RAID or AHCI mode before you load Windows. Once you've done that, you can restart and pop in your disk and start to load Windows or any other operating system that you might be loading. So now a little bit more about garbage collection. Garbage collection prevents your SSD from slowing down. And I'm going to give a very high-level overview of it here, but basically, if you have, say, a block of data saved on your SSD, and you delete information from the SSD, it doesn't delete that whole block. It deletes basically the header that tells the SSD where that information is. At some point in the future, you might go and the SSD might need to write information to that block again. If garbage collection of some kind is not enabled, what it will need to do is copy that block to the temporary storage on the SSD, erase it there, write it back, and then write it back to that block of data. Again, this is a simplified explanation, but basically it will lead to your SSD slowing down over time. Garbage collection goes through to those blocks of data that have been deleted or that have only been partially written to, and basically cleans that up in your computer's downtime to prevent this slowdown from happening. Now, the most common form of garbage collection in the operating system environment is called trim. And in order to have trim, you need an SSD that has a controller that is compatible with trim, and most new SSDs are compatible with trim. You also need a serial ATA controller that is also compatible with trim, and usually if you have serial ATA revision 2 or revision 3 on your motherboard or your notebook or higher, and that has AHCI or RAID mode like I just showed you over there, enabled as an option in the BIOS, then that will be compatible with trim. Finally, you need an operating system that supports trim. Windows 7 is one of those, newer versions of Linux, and I believe the newest version of Mac OS X Lion is also compatible with trim. So if you get all those three set up, then you'll know that your SSD will work with trim. If you're still not sure if it's working, let me show you a quick trick to figure out if it is working or not, and this is if you're using Windows 7. So a quick trick here to tell whether or not Windows 7 has trim enabled for Windows 7 users. Go to an elevated command prompt, all programs, accessories, command prompt, right-click the command prompt, run as administrator. Several ways to do that, but that's the way I have written down here. And the command prompt, type this command right here, fsutil behavior query disable delete notify. If you see disable delete notify equals 0, then yes, trim is working. If you see disable delete notify equals 1, then it's not working. You can type this command in here to enable it if it's possible. If it's not enabled, then you might have to, for instance, reinstall Windows. Now, I do get asked all the time from people who are upgrading to an SSD if they can migrate their current installation of their operating system over to the SSD. The answer is yes, it is possible, but I just don't recommend it. The easiest, the simplest, the fastest way is to reinstall Windows or Linux or whatever operating system you are using. Especially with Windows-based systems, that's just the best way to make sure that you're going to have your SSD configured correctly, that trim is going to be set up, that you don't have any old stuff from your installation on a mechanical hard drive that's going to prevent the SSD from working to its utmost potential. Speaking of testing your SSD, which is a good thing to do once you have it installed, a few free programs that are available. Crystal Disk Mark is one that I like to use. SSD is another one. You can load those up and test your SSD to make sure that you're getting the performance that is what you see rated on the box, or at least nearly rated. Another thing about information that's rated on the box is you will often see very high numbers, and you will see sequential read, sequential write speeds that are written there. And that's a great way to see, well, what can my SSD do? How fast can it go? It's good to be able to show some big numbers like that, but for most users out there, what you're going to be seeing more frequently as far as day-to-day use on a computer for web browsing, gaming, basic office work is these much smaller reads and writes, actually the 4K reads and writes that you see in those benchmarks. So pay more attention to the 4K reads and writes, not quite so much attention to the big sequential reads and write speeds. Those are nice if you're benchmarking, if you want to set up a really fast computer, and especially if you're doing more enterprise level work, dealing with large amounts of data, especially if you're doing stuff like video editing. It's very important to have very fast sequential reads and write speeds. Now, a quick note here about Serial ATA Revision 2 and Revision 3. Here we have a Serial ATA Revision 3 drive that is 6 gigabit per second. And here we also have a Serial ATA Revision 2 drive that is 3 gigabit per second, as you can see on the specs right there. Now these are backwards and forwards compatible, so for instance our Revision 2 drive will work on a SATA 3 controller. Our Revision 3 drive will work on a SATA 2 controller. Just bear in mind that you will be limited to the speeds of the controller that you're connected to or the drive that you're connecting to that controller. So you can mix and match, so if you have an older SATA Revision 2 notebook or motherboard, for example, you can buy a newer drive and be forward compatible. Just bear in mind it will limit the speeds of the drive until you upgrade to a different controller. Also, another tip is to make sure that you have the latest AHCI Serial ATA controller drivers installed for your respective motherboard and Serial ATA controller. Now, before we close up, I wanted to mention one other thing. When you install your operating system, you might have a few, well, when you're looking for an SSD, I should say, you might have a few options to choose from. So here we have, for example, 120 gig version. This one's actually 240 gig, our Vertex 3 here. And here we have a smaller capacity 32 gigabyte version. Generally speaking, for your operating system drive, which is what folks usually use an SSD for, I recommend a 64 gigabyte drive at minimum. You might find these smaller capacity drives. There's a couple things you can do with these. One example is to go with Intel's Z68 chipset, which allows you to set up smart response. You can actually pair the SSD with a mechanical hard drive like that, and they sort of actually caches data to the SSD and speeds up your mechanical hard drive's performance by putting frequently used information on the SSD itself. You can also set up RAID, so two lower capacity SSDs paired up in RAID together will give you a big boost in performance, especially the low seek times or low access times on SSDs really scale well with RAID. Now bear in mind, trim cannot pass through a RAID controller, so you will need to make sure that you have either a controller, SSD controller, garbage collection setup, or you'll need to get, for instance, a lot of manufacturers of SSD have garbage collection utilities that you can download and run in the background. And that is going to wrap it up for today's video. We hope you've learned a little bit more about SSDs, their pros and cons, and all the fantastic things that can be done with them. I'm Paul with Newegg TV, and if you enjoyed today's video, please head over to our Newegg YouTube channel and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time on Newegg TV.